Chapter 40, Midsummer's Dawn. Midsummer's Dawn. The way was busier now. Gone were the days when all they would meet upon the road were lone farmers and the occasional caravan, a blot of color in the sea of green about them to mark some shepherd. Dust hung in the air, stirred up by the constant tramp of feet along that gravel path, the clouds stretching to the horizon above the road's meandering course through the grassy plains. Fritha kept her head down, no longer bothering to send a polite nod to the scores of people who passed them. Many were bent double under all they could carry, men and women leading their families to what they hoped was a safer future, children trailing behind, small arms clasped about some treasure they refused to part with, the more fortunate groups leading wagons or beasts to carry the burdens in their stead. Fritha spared a thought to the last pony they had had to leave with the Amma and tried to ignore the dull ache in her lower back, her whole body longing for the moment it would be free of its weight. At least the plains there were cooler than the desert had been, and the journey could have almost been a pleasant one, if her pack had not been so heavy or the sun so bright. After a day of walking, Thine Gate was but a few leagues away. A large town, it sprawled over both sides of one of the Agis's main tributaries, the Eget, which found its source the mountains to the south. According to the locals, the river kept the town in the trade that was its lifeblood, something Jahara believed would be enough for them not to have closed their gates even for this talk of war, and it was there they planned to stay the night. Fritha took the sweat from her face with a sleeve and plodded on. If she had her way, they would be staying a day or so longer, too. Midsummer was but a dawn away, as were the festivities that came with it, and the girl was determined to see them, and not only for her own pleasure. They all needed a chance to remember why they were doing this, to recall the life and the simple pleasures for which they struggled now. Shouts on the road ahead, the rumble of distant hooves growing louder, and through the dust Fritha could make out two men on horseback parting the crowds at a smart trot.
"Make way! Come on, clear the road!"
Travelers were hastening back from the road, wagons dragged quickly aside. Fritha barely had time to stumble onto the grassy verge as the horses thundered past, a carriage and two heavily laden wagons rattling after them, some nobles ensuring their precious belongings were not a casualty. Across the road, a group of men were brushing the dust from the clothes, weapons glinting dully beneath the grime, mercenaries. And as Fritha could pick their kind from that road of refugees, it seemed their own group had not gone without notice either, a tall Tethiran with a thick black mustache sending a polite nod to Valigar and Minsk. Fritha forgave them the mistake, she hardly looked like the average mercenary captain.
"All right there! I tell you now, mate, you're heading the wrong way. There's nothing back there."
Imoen gestured to the people about them, slowly gathering their belongings to set out once more.
"These lot wouldn't seem to agree."
"No," the man chuckled,
"that they wouldn't. There's an army on the move, true enough. Word has it, it's struck a few places clear off the plains, but we couldn't find a trace of it, like the whole thing's just shadows and rumor." Next to him, his bearded friend was nodding. "We haven't time to waste searching for an army that might not even be hiring. It was in Erden we heard it, someone back east is calling for swords for his own purpose. Some town has raised the coin for its defense,"
posed Jahara. The first man shrugged.
"Couldn't say, but from what I heard there is plenty of gold in the offering for skilled swords. You should join us. We'll likely get a better lot if we pitch up as a larger group."
All eyes turned to Fritha. They knew the answer, but she felt grateful they respect her enough to allow her to be the one to make it, the two men realizing belatedly just who was in charge.
"We will press on, but thank you for the offer."
The man nodded, gesturing for the others to follow as he resumed their journey.
Well, don't say you weren't warned."
Fritha watched them go, those about her making no move to continue in the wake of this revelation.
Another army,
considered Valigar.
but being raised by whom? A collection of towns, or possibly an alliance of those powerful within one,
offered Jahara. Anomen was less optimistic.
Or perhaps some warlord looking to take advantage of the chaos this war to the west will seed. Oh, great,
snorted Imoen.
Another army, just what we need.
Fritha dipped her face as the smile quirked, something amusing about the idea of Baal being resurrected only to find the people of Tether had taken his vengeance for him, the land decimated by war and wasted to the point where even he could ravage it no more. In her mind, he kicked over a mountain and sulked off to Tisirik.
Well,
pressed Jahara, setting out again with a purposeful stride,
either way should get moving. Thine gate may yet have more answers on this, and we must make the town by sunset.
Fritha fell in behind her, Solafane at her side and seemingly lost in a world far from that dusty road.
Sola.
He started to her, surprised to find her there. Fritha sent him a smile.
And where are you today? Here, mostly. Something amuses you. I'll tell you later.
The sun was a fierce, fat wedge upon the horizon by time they reached the town. The gates were still open, at least nominally, and a small group of town guards loitered just inside, watching their approach with surly frowns. Fritha considered throwing on a smile and thought better of it, perhaps it was best not to provoke them. About her, the others were preparing similarly. Jahara set her shoulders, just daring any to halt her, while Minsk stared straight ahead, the blank gaze of a foreigner, and Solafane drew in his faded yellow cloak to flick his hat an inch lower. The guards watched in silence. Fritha wondered if they would speak at all, and she was a step past the threshold, when
we were just about to close them for the night.
The guard who had spoken was not smiling, no inflection of welcome to his tone, the man impassive as he and his brothers waited on their answer. Fritha flashed him a tentative smile.
I guess Timora is with us.
His craggy face remained a mask.
I reckon so.
They trooped past without further comment, the air somehow colder in the shadow of those high stone walls, and Fritha just suppressed a flinch as the shriek of hinges and rattle of locks closed them in. Thine gate was not large, somewhere between Marmont and Syrah in size and affluence, stone and wooden houses set along neat streets that sloped down to the river, and a little over the other side. Most houses had been decorated in preparation for midsummer, people hanging bright flags from their windows, the more wealthy draping their sills with festoons of flowers, while colored streamers fluttered from every door handle. Some people had even put the patterns of colored sand on their doorsteps ready for the morrow. But it felt like a facade, an adorned debutante who had no heart for the party she was attending. There were few people in the streets, those that were still about hurrying past, heads down and focused on their errand. 3 young children playing hopscotch in front of their house, ushered inside by an older sister as the group passed.
Friendly here, isn't it?
Muttered Imoen. Valigar shrugged.
At least, they allowed us in. Here,
said Fritha, gesturing to the tavern at the end of the street,
this one looks all right.
In truth, she had heard the place long before she had seen it, the clamor of loud voices and laughter that echoed along the street seeming incongruent in that silent town.
Wait here,
Fritha muttered to the rest of them, Imoen and Jahara chosen as the least threatening of their group, at least in look, to accompany her as she stepped up to the door. The din hit her like a wall, and then silence, every face in that light, airy room turned to them. Behind the bar, the hoary innkeep had stopped halfway through cleaning the counter before him, the stout man settling back slowly to push the cloth into his apron and fold one fleshy arm over the other. Fritha stepped up to the counter. Now was the time for winning smiles.
Well met, sir, we'd like.
He did not let her finish.
We've no rooms free. Not even one,
exclaimed Imoen. The impassive frown did not waver.
That's what I said, isn't it? And we don't need any sellswords bringing trouble here either.
Fritha dipped her face meekly, letting the roll infuse her. He would not likely back down, but it was worth a shot.
I understand everyone is worried, but the guards let us pass, please, we just...
The scrape of a chair cut her off. A large man sat at the table behind, standing to tower over her, eyes dark above the bushy black beard.
He said, they're full.
Fritha felt her hand twitch, blood screaming for her to draw her blade. That this man would try to intimidate her. For an instant, the urge to skewer him where he stood was electrifying.
Fine,
she snapped with some difficulty.
A fair midsummer to you all. Bastards!
Swore Imoen as soon as they were in the street.
Gutless, miserable bastards! No room, I take it,
concluded Inomen.
No,
Fritha sighed, thumb and forefinger pinching the bridge of her nose. She suddenly had most intense headache.
So where now?
Imoen seemed to feel better for her curses, the girl casting further along the street.
Perhaps they'll know of somewhere. Hey,
she called, the boys whose game she had interrupted whipping back to them.
Do you want to earn a copper?
A muttered conference between the pair, and one was even brave enough to cock a snook before they haired off down the street. Imoen shouted something very rude after them.
Imoen!
Jahara scolded tiredly, straightening her long frame from where she was leant against the hitching post.
Come, there will likely be another inn nearer the market square.
There was, and after they had established that it, too, was full, they tried the two over at the west gate and the one on the river, but it was the same story everywhere. Fritha stared up at the derelict wooden shack before them. The building, according to a couple of sailors they had met, passed for what had to be the dingiest doss house she had ever seen, and, with a good few months living in the Ithcatlan slums under her belt, she felt that was quite an achievement. Like many of the buildings around them down there on the riverside, it has clearly been a warehouse at one point, the wooden walls patched and repaired over the years, while tiles were missing from the high roof, shuttered windows a luxury enjoyed only by the two upper floors. Fritha gazed at the mismatched, mouldering doors, watching her dreams of a good wash and a hot meal melt before her eyes.
Here!
cried Imoen,
we're staying here.
Fritha tried a smile.
Well, look at it this way, somewhere this down market can't afford to be picky. I'd rather sleep outside. We cannot now,
said Valigar evenly, the man taking a step towards the doors.
The gates are closed.
Inside, a tavern had been built, the windowless room lit by oil lamps that smoked upon the scattering of grimy tables. A staircase ran up the back wall, disappearing above a low ceiling which had been added much later, a counter that was likely built about the same time, set at the end a few paces from the doors. It appeared that a good score of other, similar unwelcome mercenaries had found refuge there, too. The men were seated about the three largest tables on an assortment of chairs, stools, and upturned crates, a group of Kalimshites in one corner, while some Tathirans had a table nearest the bar, a smaller group of mixed foreigners just before the stairs. At the bar, a lone merchant was standing, the man complaining over his cup to the two men behind the counter. The elder of the pair was thick-set and indifferent, shaved head and stubbly face giving his tanned skin a grey look. His younger server was of the local colouring and gangly with it, the youth showing an interest in the tale.
Demmed key master! Refusing to let me unload because I wouldn't pay their tax. It is industrial alcohol, not a luxury good. You cannot drink it. I dunno,
the youth laughed.
I imagine some sots round here would give it a go.
The merchant sighed, setting his empty cup down before him.
Ah, another one, lad, then I'll have to head back.
Frithha stepped up to the bar in the lull, the barman sending her a curt nod in the most welcoming greeting she had had that evening.
All right. You. Sinno, we're out of ale,
cut in the youth. Sinno shot him a stern glower.
Well, then run over to the Fahids and fetch some. You want a room?
He continued to her bluntly,
10 gold pieces for the lot of you. 10 gold.
Choked Imoen.
I didn't realize this was Thynagate's most exclusive hotel.
Sinno was utterly unfazed by her scorn.
That's the price, take it or leave. And I want another 20 as deposit, seeing as you're foreigners, too many people skipping out leaving the room's estate. Here.
He thrust a stained scrap of parchment with the amount scrawled on it across the wood as Frithha counted the coin onto the bar.
You sign for the deposit, just make a cross if you can't handle a quill.
Frithha took great satisfaction in signing her name with a flourish. Sinno ran an eye over it and nodded once.
Rooms are upstairs. You're on the top floor, left door as you get to the landing. There ain't no locks, so keep an eye on your stuff. Anything goes missing and it ain't my responsibility.
The lodgings were a little better than the tavern, though at least in their numbers they did not have to share with any strangers. Frithha would have felt safer sleeping on the street had it not been the case. They were on the second of the 2 floors that had been built above the tavern, the large room taking up half the upper floor and then further divided into another 3 rooms by wooden partitions so poor, Frithha could worm a finger through the gaps. The central room was the largest of the 3, 4 greying pallets thrown haphazardly against the walls, similar arrangements found in the adjoining 2 rooms. At least there were windows up there, Jahara's first action upon entering to throw them wide to the cool twilight, which helped somewhat with the fusty smell. Lamps had to be hired from bar at extra cost. The main room where they had gathered for a quick meal of rations cast multi-hued grotto in the group's many ware lights.
Gods,
huffed Imoen, setting down her empty plate with a less than satisfied sigh.
I can't believe I was actually looking forward to staying in a town for the night. Why even let us through the gates if they didn't plan to let us anywhere to stay? This talk of war had everyone wary,
offered Jahara.
You cannot blame them. I think you'll find I can. They might not even have to wait for the war if they treat every group of mercs so badly.
Valigar eased an arm about the girl's shoulders.
It is only for one night, at least. Well,
ventured Frithha, stomach squirming as the druid leveled an even gaze upon her.
I was wondering if we shouldn't stay tomorrow night, as well, for the celebrations.
Imoen was agog.
Celebrations? Here? Are you sure they know it's midsummer?
Jahara joined her in a frown.
If we are to celebrate, then I would rather we were out of the town anyway. Well, we can't all frolic with the trees,
snapped Imoen.
Jahara is right,
Valigar countered, in a weighty tone that was sure to needle the girl.
At any festivities, the ale flows and judgment is put aside, we may not find our presence here welcome. Sod them. Who are they to tell us where we can stay or drink or anything? Young Imoen,
came Minsk's mellow rebuke,
who knows it is unfair, but there is no honor in rousing a fight with those of less skill.
Frithha wasn't sure she cared whether they stayed or not now, as long as she didn't have to spend Midsummer's Day putting up with this bickering. Perhaps she and Solafane could get lost in the crowds for a few hours and leave the others to their squabbles. She sent a glance to the man next to her, hoping for that look they would sometimes share, a reminder she was not alone in this. But Solafane was picking over his dish, the distance back to his eyes. Wherever he was, Fritha wished she were there too. Opposite her, a gnomon drew himself up. The bickering, it seemed, was only just beginning.
I am surprised that is the only objection here. Have you forgotten that we seek a ballspawn at least the equal of Yogashura and Abyssigil? We have already delayed now over 210 days for our journey into the desert, and you would have us waste time here on trivial diversions. That is a little harsh, a gnomon,
rebuked Jahara coolly.
We have yet to hear any real evidence of an army on the march.
Fritha decided to cut things off before they could escalate.
I just thought. So you would rather wait until we begin passing the raised farmsteads before we make any haste? It would certainly make it easier to locate this Sendai. It was only. Save your sarcasm, boy, we all know what is at stake here and I have lost just as much to it as you. It was just an idea,
yelled Fritha over the clamor, voice dropping to a sigh as all heads whipped to her.
I thought it might be nice to see what we're fighting for, is all. As it is, we'll likely stay and some local will cheek us and everyone will kick off and we'll all be reminded what a waste of effort this all is. Gods, Fritha,
muttered Imoen,
you could make liar and mope.
A gnomon was gaping at her with an incredulous frown.
Do you truly believe, after all we have faced so far, we would need to be reminded what our struggles are for? Well, then I was wrong,
Fritha intoned dully,
and we can leave at first light.
She turned to the girl opposite, ready to distance herself from that whole mess.
Did you want to catch up any study tonight, Imoen?
The girl in question lolled indifferently against the man next to her.
Nah, I'm too tired. You said that the last time I offered.
Fritha spared a furtive glance to the ranger she was draped over.
You were so excited when Master Omir sold you that book on summoning. Do not think this is my doing,
countered Valigar to her look.
She has refused my offers also.
Imoen snapped upright and her tone was no milder.
Don't start, you two, I said I'm tired. Here.
She continued, bending over her pack to root in the depths.
We should see to your hand before we bed down, you know it must be massaged at least twice daily.
Imoen had taken it upon herself to take charge of Valigar's recovery since their departure from Amkathran, the girl learning the techniques from Jahara with a patience that had previously been reserved only for her magic studies. Fritha imagined they were far from as gratifying though, after that first evening watching the man grimace and whimper, Imoen thin-lipped and silent as she had slowly worked upon the stiff muscles. Valigar relinquished the girl his hand with barely a flicker of hesitation, the clawed fingers resting palm up on his knee as Imoen produced a pot of the druid's salve. Fritha turned away, the others rising with her to give the pair some privacy for the less than pleasant task.
Minsk, a gnomon, and I can sleep through in the front room,
offered Jahara, the woman standing to heft up her pack.
Fritha, you and Solafane can take the back.
Through the shuttered window light from a swinging lantern danced across the wall opposite, the watchman in the street below rounding the corner for it to vanish in a blink. Hours ago, a bright beam of silver had marked the slow creep of time, but the moon was long set now, Solafane left to stare at the murky rafters and listen to the rats scurry in the loft above them. Fritha slept fitfully at his side, blankets knotted about her body and that wealth of amber hair still bound up as it had been in the day, kept from her shoulders and neck in the lingering heat. Neither had wished to brave what passed for the bed there. The mattress was covered in suspect stains while the lower portion slowly was collapsing, losing its straw to some tenacious rodent, and they had just pushed it aside in the end to place their own bedding on the floor, side by side. It had been a long night. The rabble of drunks had peaked as the taverns along the river closed one by one, their shouts ebbing away to leave the sleeping town still once more, broken now and then by the distant bark of dogs or clattering feet of some watch patrol. An hour or so ago, two men in the room below had had some strident disagreement that had ended in a visit from the innkeep. All had been silent since, but Solafane was still no closer to sleep. He could have blamed it on the heat, on their less than friendly welcome to the town, but he knew what kept him staring at that cobwebbed ceiling. The Underdark. Once it had been a place he had little time to think on, absorbed as he was in the new world in which he was striving to find a home. Then it was somewhere he considered only when he had to, brought to it by some recollection or a question from his companions. But ever since they had set out to take battle to this Sendai, it seemed he could dwell on nothing else. Everything had been different there, not just his life and role, but his whole world. Even the darkness was unlike anything he had experienced on the surface, so total and oppressing, yet freeing too, the utter absence of light allowing other senses to reach out and find the glancing sounds and scents that could so easily be missed as they were carried past upon the trembling air. Up there, everything was grand and beautiful, but so bold with it, trees and mountains stretching to the sky, rivers slicing through the rippling plains, the landscape painted in dazzling hues. That place was one of life, pervasive and unrestrained, a chaos of colors, scents and sounds merging into a vibrant, indefinable roar, and the ache within him only grew as he considered the subtle, silent world he could never again call home. He had prayed to Illustre that night, cheeks burning as he silently beseeched her for guidance, the man embarrassed he was unable to master these troubles alone, yet feeling foolish at keeping them from her when she would already know the secrets of his heart. He had been so sure she had wanted him there, on the surface, the place he had spent his life longing for, so why did he feel like he had lost a part of himself? If the lady had any answer though, she did not impart it to him, and he had shuttered the window against her moon and bedded down just as burdened as when he had knelt before it. Next to him, Fritha shifted under the blankets, turning one way only to flip sharply back again, snorting as she fought to straighten her twisted garments. His voice was hoarse after so long in silence.
"You are awake?"
A slight sigh that was almost lost to the rustle of bedding as she turned to face him, the girl rolling onto her stomach to scoop pale arms under her pillow. The blankets had long ago been tossed from her legs in the heat, 2 feet raised and kicking idly in the air. Her henna was completely faded by now and he had almost forgotten what she looked like without it, legs, shoulders and arms overly white in the gloom and almost a match to the slip she slept in.
"Can't settle either,"
she confirmed quietly.
"I managed to drift off at first, but that fight woke me. I've just been dozing for the last hour." "You?" "I never slept."
"Perhaps you could make your prayers again," she offered, rolling onto her back to gaze up to the rafters as he had been.
"They always seem to bring you a certain peace. Or we could get up, take a walk about town. I would sometimes get up in Candlekeep, when I couldn't sleep. The library looked so different at night, those mundane rooms I had spent my whole life within instantly transformed into some mysterious land outlined in silver and black, and with it the trembling thrill of being the only person in the world. I would sneak down to the kitchens or up to the attics or sometimes go and wake Imoen."
A ripple of soft laughter.
"I would give her such a fright."
He watched her pause, the smile fading in her eyes.
"You and Imoen. We're friends, but it will never been as it was, and she doesn't even know the worst of it yet." "You agree then,"
he continued hopefully,
"that not telling the others of your coming fate will only make matters worse?"
The girl just sighed.
"It was always a stupid idea, Solafane, I just don't have a better one. Besides, stupid ideas are my forte at the moment. My offers to stay here for midsummer were met with derision from all quarters."
Solafane swallowed a sigh on his own and let the matter die. For the time being, their talk returned to less prickly matters.
"Midsummer. I understand from the name what the day means to celebrate, but I would assume there is more to the festivities than merely the midpoint of your calendar.
Frithia smiled in the darkness, seemingly glad to tell him.
It is a day of lovers and promises. Many courtships will become betrothals tomorrow, and likely many more courtships will begin. The abundant wine tends to help with that. Young and old take their revelry until the following dawn, and I certainly did when we saw the night celebrated in the gate. I remember the feeling so clearly, stood in the street watching some flock of girls my own age trip past in their best dresses with flowers in their hair, and I was there in tunic and sword. Even after everything, it was the first time it truly struck me how different I was from other girls.
For a moment, Frithia was somewhere far away.
Anyway, she continued blithely, most places along the Sword Coast have street festivities arranged, with music, dancing and many stalls selling food, love charms and other, aids to intimacy. I'd hoped the day had enough importance to be celebrated here, even in the current troubles, though it doesn't look as though we will be welcome within the walls. I suppose Jahara will have her way after all, and we'll all spend the night prancing about the plains in our underclothes. It will likely fit the day better than anything we could have got up to here in the town. Flydia once told me that in ancient times, the day was sacred to the old gods and how their stars aligned were seen as some great celestial mating. The priests would spend the night charting the pairings to predict events in the coming years, and doing some coupling of their own, of course, so at least Imoen and Valigar will be occupied.
She snorted at her own humor, glancing to him to continue.
Do the drow celebrate anything similar? Well, obviously not for the summer or lovers or, well, something not very similar at all now I consider it. Not as such,
he conceded with a smile, trying and failing to ignore the pang.
Most festivities in Ustnatha are religious holidays marked by extra sacrifices and prayers to Lolth, the more influential houses competing over how many slaves they can afford to send to the altar. There is one festival I know unique to our city though, which celebrates our role in the first descent millennia ago. It is closer to the festivities you hold here, with gatherings and feasting, though even then, Lolth is present in all things. She is a jealous goddess and does not take well to being forgotten in anything, great or small. They are celebrated each decade, on the day of our recorded descent. I recall one such event.
Frithia closed the space between them, the pair settling shoulder to shoulder for his tale.
I had been given duties in another part of the city, but Feyre had managed to secure me a place in her entourage. We were already lovers by then, though it was but the beginning of the—
He chose the word carefully, intimacy that was to grow between us. I spent most of the day walking the festivities with Feyre. There were street performances recreating the battles between the elves and drow, recitation of poems celebrating our glorious legacy of blood and expansion, and the customary run of prayers and sacrifices at the temple.
The matrons of all the greater houses would sponsor some entertainment for the masses, even these gifts to the city usually some tortuous way they had schemed to slight a rival or garner an advantage. Argelis had arranged a dueling pit, and when all the exotic creatures and slaves had been vanquished, she had the area open to challenges among those watching. I learned from Feyre later that Argelis had heard the eldest daughter of House Pyrrhic boasting about the skill of their warriors, one Ilfayan particularly. Not that such boasting bothered Argelis in the slightest, but it had irked the matron of House Deve, with whom Argelis wished to strengthen their, at best, tenuous ties. Ilfayan was immediately volunteered by his house, and as he slew the first two males unlucky enough to be put against him, Argelis had approached Feyre. There were two males the matron herself had requested accompany her daughter that day, both skilled warriors from other houses. She asked her daughter before all, who Feyre thought should be put forward as the next challenger. To her mother's well-concealed displeasure, Feyre suggested myself. She picked you to fight. It may not have seemed a kindness, but in her decision her favor was clear. I was not the obvious choice. I was not head of the city's male warriors at that time, or even ranked highly among them. This was a chance to advance myself, as long as I survived it. Argelis agreed and, after I won, seemed to accept Feyre's suggestion that she had chosen me with foreknowledge of my prowess, though I wonder if such favor did not raise the matron's suspicions even then. Perhaps we were doomed from the start. As for Feyre, the credit of this victory was acknowledged in a few treasures from her house's vault, and from these she made a present to me, a reward for my service, or so she said. I received a fine mithril dagger, old and very rare, and, rarer, still a book, written in the time just after the descent that day was celebrating. Feyre knew I had more scholarly pursuits than my fellows, though she never realized the significance of her gift. There was a chapter devoted to the gods and Alistree's role in the banishment, all written with the particular slant of my people, of course, but, still, there it was in ink and vellum, an account of my lady and her sacrifice for her children. I treasured it.
And for an instant he felt it again, that swelling sense of pride and something else, so fine and hot he had dared not consider it as Feyre had handed him that thin, hide-bound volume.
What happened to them, the gifts, I mean?
Came the soft voice next to him. It took him a moment to answer.
I lost the dagger in a fight with a beholder in the lower tunnels. The book I destroyed along with the rest of my notes concerning Alastre. It was too dangerous to keep them after Feyre was taken.
He sighed deeply, feeling somehow empty now the tale was done.
It seems like another life now, perhaps it is. And one that haunts you enough to keep you from sleep,
came the girl beside him, Frithha merely smiling as he jerked to her.
I have heard of you speak of your home many times, Solifane, but never with such longing.
Embarrassment choked him, and for a moment they lay in a silence broken only by the scrabble of the rats above. Something in his chest felt very heavy, a weight he had not noticed before, but suddenly realized he had always carried with him.
I confess I am thinking on the Underdark more and more since we set course to take battle to others of my brethren. You mean Sendai and her army? Yes, the more we hear of it, the more it seems my first assumption that she raised force of surfacers was incorrect. An army of shadows and secrets.
He felt the sneer curl his lip.
It sounds more than familiar. I suppose, though I doubt they can all be drow. Who would tempt Lolth's anger just to follow the child of some human god? Sendai might even been half-blood, like me. Perhaps, and I agree that it is unlikely her whole army will be drow. Duergar, though, will follow any with gold and such means will secure slaves and mercenaries both above and below ground. But if there are any drow with them, if they have turned their backs on Lolth for this, then perhaps.
He trailed off, hesitating on the edge of the possibilities. Frith's voice came a shade shriller than usual.
You would convert them to Alastre. I feel they must be made aware of it as an alternative,
he clarified.
So much of being drow is merely not knowing anything different. If dissatisfaction led them to leave Lolth, then how many serve Feyre still unknowing of the choices they have? Sendai,
said Frithha quietly. Solifane turned to her.
Sorry. You said Feyre. She plays on your mind.
That flash of heat, just as when he had knelt before Alastre and confessed his fears, his face burning. Always he had been in control, of actions, even emotions, but it was as though this longing for home had opened the lid upon something he could not now force close.
Yes, well, just of late,
he added hastily. He did not want Frithha under the impression he had been thinking on his former lover since he had left the Underdark with her. It felt like a betrayal somehow.
Thinking on the past inevitably leads back to her, to Ustnatha. I do not regret leaving, but this world is very different from the one I left, as is my place in it. I am frightened to consider it, lest I come to realize I have lost something I will pine after forever. What's like there? How can I describe it? How would you describe this world you have up here to one who has never seen it? I don't know, she answered simply. I suppose I'd start with the grass and work my way up.
Solafane could not help a smile. Perhaps he did overcomplicate things.
Well, there are the caverns and tunnels that you have seen and most surfacers would know of, but it is so much more than that. Ah, where do I even begin? You may not believe it, but there are seasons in the Underdark, though they are not as yours. All civilizations there are constrained by the need for fresh water, and we Drow are no exception. Ustnatha is closer to the surface than many cities, and we feel the changes in your world more keenly than most. In your spring, the snows thaw and below the earth, the rivers rise, the lower tunnels closed in the coming floods. The moisture hangs in the air and many of the fungi strains spore, some caverns rendered impassable by great clouds that clog the eyes and lungs. As summer comes to your lands, the waters drop once more and the deeper tunnel open. The churning waters have often opened new passages or eroded old ones to reveal veins of minerals and precious stones. Above, the season changes again. The rains fall and below the rivers swell, this rise the sign we await to begin the annual harvest of the kelpweed beds. I would go to watch them sometimes. There was something calming in the way the flat-bottomed boats were hauled slowly back and forth across the lakes, slaves pulling bushels of dark red leaves from the black surface. Most is pickled or dried, while any fresh water is stored in great reservoirs ready for the coming scarcity. As your world freezes, ours faces drought. Additional water is collected from the poisonous lakes to the south and distilled at great expense to the city. It is at this time of year, houses traditionally call any old or unwanted slaves in order to preserve water. Listen to me.
He snorted, bitterly recalling the reason he had been forced from his home in the first.
I cannot even tell you the lands without returning to the cruelty of my people. I swear, they are a plague. That does not change the place, Sola,
the girl reminded gently.
No, but the taint they leave is inextricable.
Frithha drew a breath, perhaps to reproach or offer some consolation, her words lost in a furious thudding from the street below that seemed to quake the whole building. The shutters had been rattled open by the force, an ominous orange light slicing through the gap.
Open up! We're here for Frithha.
The girl silently mouthed the summons.
Frithha!
She glanced to him and suddenly they were both up, the girl hissing curses as they scrabbled for their clothes.
Bastard, bastard, bastard! Frithha? And which Horsens are looking for me under that name?
The Harpers? The Tetheran army? The Silver Chalice? The choices seemed limitless, though Solafane saw no need to voice as much. Beyond the partition, he could hear the others stirring, the groggy murmurs becoming quickly more urgent. Frithha was struggling with her second boot, the girl hopping over to the window as she stamped it on.
Are they soldiers?
He pressed. She peered cautiously through the open shutters.
Doesn't look like it. This is your only warning. Send the girl out now, or we torch the place. Son of a...
In the main room, the others were already up and dressed, Imoen hurriedly shoving the last few things into her pack.
What in hell's is going on, Frithha? I don't bloody know. They look to have the street outside closed off,
muttered Valigar from the shutters.
Come on,
announced Jahara, grabbing her pack to head for the door.
We can't get trapped in here.
Downstairs, the other guests were assembling, bleary-eyed and dragging their bag with them, a tall Kalimshite going toe-to-toe with the thick-set barman.
What the fuck is happening, Sinnoh? You sold someone here out. I ain't done nothing.
His shorter friend was trying to get between them.
Just calm down, Raj, they ain't calling for any of us. What in hell's is he shouting about now?
exclaimed a wiry northerner from the doors.
You lot, quiet down.
Outside, the men's demands echoed into the night.
Any others in there, leave now, and we won't attack, we only want the girl. Yeah, get out now before we torch place. They wouldn't dare,
roared Sino. His young server didn't look as sure, the lad eyeing the doors with a hesitant longing.
And who's him to tell us?
Snorted a well-built Tethiran.
Just give him what he wants,
offered his older friend tiredly.
Who is this Fritha lass anyway?
It was as though the whole room seemed to turn at once to find her, stood with her friends and the only other two women there before the stairs.
Her, that's her!
Yelled Sino, bristly arm thrown to her. Fritha drew herself up.
Says who? Says your chit.
He sneered, waving that scrap of paper at her, her name upon it in a fine, scrolling hand. Fritha felt her heart sink, her moment of impulsive vanity there accusing her.
Go on, get out.
Solafane gave pause to any who were considering forcing the issue, his blade but a flash in a blur of yellow as cloak was thrown back and sword drawn all in one agile sweep.
Stay back.
Raj took one look at the pair and shouldered his pack.
This ain't worth my life, I'm off.
His brothers were following suit, Sino hastening around the counter to try and catch them.
Oi, you lot still owe for your...
The slam of the door cut him off.
Fuck.
At the door, the pale northerner was still peering through the narrow gap.
There's guards out there, too.
A pair of blue eyes narrowed upon Fritha.
What have you done?
Fritha shrugged.
I don't know, we only arrived this afternoon.
One of the Tethirans joined him at the doors.
That's Garant's lot, a local band with ties to the town. They'd only be here if the coin is good. They're gold on you, girl?
Asked his friend.
Here, why should we give her up?
One of the younger men appealed excitedly.
If there's coin to be claimed, we can take her in ourselves.
Imoen let magic pulse eloquently about the fingers of one raised hand.
You can try.
In the street, a gruff voice broke the standoff.
You've to the count of 10. Shit!
Swore the northerner, his companions grabbing up their packs.
I'm out of here. Whatever's on her, it's not worth this.
The Tethirans followed them, Sino roughly hauling his server back as the youth made to creep off as well. Fritha turned her attention to her own friends. Besieged in a warehouse was not the most tactical position, they needed more room to maneuver. Valigar had the same idea, familiar frown settled upon her.
I believe it is time for our company ways to part.
Fritha caught on fast.
You fickle whoreson. Go on then, go. Hells take you. All of you.
The ranger turned, a firm hand ensuring Imoen left with him, Anomen, Jahara and Minsk following without a glance. Solafane adjusted the grip on his blade, a unanimous vote had left him as her ally, now all they could do was wait and be ready. Valigar still had the lead as they crossed the street. Most of the men they had lodged with had moved on while the mercenaries, he noted, were fanned about the building, much fewer in number than he had first surmised. Their leader, Garant, was standing further back from the rest at the crossroad to afford a good view of both sides of the building. He cut an impressive figure, a tall, dark-skinned man in black heavy leathers, his wiry hair kept short and braid back in neat cornrows. Nearby, the squad of town guards who had arrived with them were gathered, one of the Tethrian mercs talking earnestly to their captain, their voices becoming clearer as they made their approach.
You are sure these here were her companions? They arrived with her, though perhaps they've had a change of loyalties since then. Good, report to the guardhouse tomorrow for a reward. What is going on here?
Demanded Jahara. The guard captain was a lean man of middling years and local coloring, his hawk-like face casting the woman over with a slowly appraising look, as though he was trying to ascertain whether she was worth his time to answer.
We are allowing the town's mercenary guild to apprehend a dangerous fugitive,
he replied at length.
You will come with us, for your own protection. We need no protection,
rumbled Minsk, Imoen echoing him in vehement agreement.
Yeah, you should be stopping these mercs, instead of standing here as they threaten to commit arson and murder.
The guard captain let his gaze assess their company in grim silence.
Captain Daviel,
ventured his sergeant. The man nodded.
Sergeant, arrest them, they may know something of our fugitive or be party to her crimes. Hey, what are you doing?
Cried Imoen, the swords about the suddenly drawn and closing in.
We haven't done anything.
Behind her, a Noman had his mace in hand.
You have no grounds for this,
he roared.
This is outside the law.
But his protests were lost as the crash of splintering wood shattered the night.
And then there were two,
offered Fritha to the eerie stillness. Outside, temper seemed to be escalating, Imoen's shrill shouts echoing off the surrounding warehouses.
You,
snapped Solafane, the young server shrinking from his blade,
check the door. What is happening out there?
The lad crept forward, clearly fighting the temptation to bolt outside as he cracked the doors.
Your friends, well, them ones with you, they're being arrested by the guards. Arrested?
Repeated Fritha.
They were only after me.
A heavy thud from somewhere behind the bar forestalled any discussion, the noise rattling through the warehouse, and the building had barely stopped quaking when another dislodged yet from dust from the ceiling.
The back door,
cried the youth, they're going to break it down.
Are there any other ways out?
Demanded Fritha. Sinnoh slowly shook his head.
Nope, only the two.
Solafane knew of another.
The roofs. Quickly.
The drow had the lead as they raced up the stairs, Fritha pounding after him, taking 2 steps at a time. Their room was as they'd left it. Solafane hauled the mattress aside as she threw the shutters wide. A crash sounded somewhere beneath them, Sinnoh's shouts carrying up the stairs.
You first,
the drow commanded, eyes fixed on the doorway opposite and sword ready. The air was cold, her skin bristling as she climbed out onto the narrow sill, fingers gripped tightly about the frame above. The sky was a pale grey, she had not realized how late it was, only an hour before the dawn that came so early in that season. Glary clouds rolled overhead, the dark street reeling below. She turned her body and was suddenly back in Candlekeep at the highest window of the library tower, the wind from the sea whipping her hair about her face to leave her almost blind, hands feeling up to find the roof that began but a foot above it. Her fingers closed upon moldy wooden tiles, it would require a jump. Her whole body recoiled with the fear as she edged the other hand up and leapt as high as she could, fingers screaming as arms took the momentum to haul the rest of her onto the roof.
Here, your pack.
Fritha leaned down to grab the 2 bags he passed out, hauling them onto the roof next her. Solafane was already following them, 2 hands appearing on tiles, and she leaned over the edge, closing fingers about his belt. A shout somewhere below her.
There, at the window.
The bolt from a crossbow hummed beneath them to disappear through the open shutters, a second splitting the gable just below her head.
Solafane, hurry!
One last heave. He rolled onto the roof and back onto his feet in one smooth movement, a hand about her wrist instantly pulling her after him. Frithia staggered to her feet. Down in the street next to them, her friends were struggling with the guards, magic exploding with Imoen's shriek to floor, all but Valigar and herself.
Imoen!
The girl's face darted up to find her.
Frithia! Head for the walls!
Another bolt streaked past her shoulder, Solafane ended their exchange there. Tiles scattered to the street below as he pulled Frithia after him and the pair fled into the night. The swarthy guild leader, Garant, was already shouting his orders, his men regrouping to make their pursuit east after their fugitive. Imoen glanced to the man next her, Valigar still hunched over and hissing soft curses into his clawed hand. That wave of anger threatened to overwhelm her, if any touched him again. The guards were certainly in no state to try then, sprawled on their backs in an uneven ring about her, her friends thrown similarly to the cobbles by the explosion of indiscriminating fury. Next to them, Anomen was struggling to his feet, Minsk and Jahara on the other side of the circle and attempting the same, Captain Daviel trying to untangle himself from his sergeant, the man red-faced and bellowing.
You men, kill these dissidents! None are to survive.
Imoen did not need to hear the rest, hand about the ranger's arm and pulling him after her. Minsk and Jahara were up and fleeing south into the town, Imoen leading Valigar and Anomen west along the riverside, dodging crates and moorings, boats bobbing serenely next to them on the dark water. A look back confirmed most of the guards were following them, Imoen forcing her body faster, limbs screaming as she tried to increase the distance between them.
It's too open,
she panted, swerving from the main quays into the next alleyway with barely a glance behind to confirm the men were still with her. She kept uphill, trying to head back towards the town proper and lose the guards in the maze of back alleys. But the winding rat runs were as much hindrance as help, some promising passage looping back on itself to find them back at quayside once more, and Imoen was fast losing sense of where they were. Another crossroads saw her diving left, the group almost at the end of the narrow lane before they realized it was a dead end. The sound of their pursuers had faded a while back, enough, at least, for them to pause a moment and get their bearings, and Anomen immediately whirled upon her, anger choking him as he fought to both shout and catch his breath.
That spell! Why did you attack them? You were the first to draw your weapon. We could have still talked them round. Oh, yeah? Whilst they were manhandling us and shooting at Frithia.
Imoen turned gentler attentions to the man next to her.
How is it? Fine, don't touch it.
He snapped as she made to check the hand he was still cradling to his chest. Anomen had set to pacing, seemingly the only outlet for his building frustrations.
How in the hells are we to get out of here?
Imoen let her mind fly over the options. Valigar could never scale the walls like this and Anomen would have great trouble sneaking anyway in that armor. All the gates would be locked and guarded.
The river!
Cried Imoen. Anomen was livid.
You expect us to swim? No, we.
Voices just about the corner, there was no time to hide. Anomen was running before the girl could even summon a spell, the two oblivious guards rounding the alley mouth to meet the knight's charge, his shield sending them both sprawling.
Come on!
He yelled, and Imoen tore after him, Valigar fast on her heels as angry shouts echoed after them. Jahara ran on, keeping to the alleys as she and Minsk fled east. She had not had any sight of the guards for a while now, though it was no longer men they raced. In the chaos, Minsk had pulled her south, the pair running back towards the town, a breathless exchange confirming their plan along the way. The east gate was the smallest of Dynaгаte's 3 entrants and likely only guarded by a couple of watchmen at that hour. The druid was sure they could convince them to open it, as long as they could outrun news of this disturbance. Jahara paused at the alley mouth, catching her breath in the darkness, a glance along the empty street next to them easing her nerves. She was keeping her bearings by the temple to Joaquin that bordered the marketplace to their west, the gilt spire glinting softly against the curdled sky.
We are still on course, Minsk. A few more streets south and then we can cut across.
The hiss of tearing paper behind followed by her name, and Jahara turned to find a sheet of parchment held before her in one large fist, Minsk's face frowning above it.
Here, good Jahara, who saw this upon the wall? Let it be known to all those of martial intent, that the sovereignty of Tethur will reward the sum of 3,000 gold pieces for the head of the infamous Balspawn and leader of that group known as the Five, Frithia of Candlekeep, for acts of sedition, murder, and abject brutality.
It was followed by a description that was decent enough to pick the girl out of a crowd. After all, how many young, female red-haired mercenaries were there?
Who says, how do they know young Frithia is called Frithia and of the blood? She is Freya to all others.
Jahara snorted, resisting the urge to screw the parchment into a tight knot and hurl it to the gutter.
Not all, Minsk. The Harpers knew, they could have told others. And leader of the Five? The Harpers certainly know of them as does the Silver Chalice. I do not know.
Minsk! Came the cry, the pair whipping up to see a dark shape loom from the silhouette of the crumbling chimney stacked high above them, Frithia's form emerging from the shadows.
And Jahara, too.
The girl breathed, guttering groaning as she leaned down into the street to see them better, Solafane still standing to keep watch at her shoulder.
Thanks be. Have you seen the others?
Jahara shook her head.
No, they ran west along the river and we lost them. Ilmater's blood. Why does this always happen to us?
The lament had likely been rhetorical, but the druid had her answer.
There is a bounty on you. Another one.
The girl cried incredulously.
What are they offering? 3,000 gold. 3. Hell's teeth. Why do I only rile up rich people? We need to get you out of here,
pressed Solafane,
and soon. I cannot see anyone giving up the chase with such a sum upon you.
Minsk was nodding gravely.
We had planned to outrun this trouble, but who doubts you will be able to do the same? Here,
a thud as first Frithia's and then Solafane's pack was dropped into the alley just behind them.
Can you take our packs out, too? Sorry to ask.
Frithia continued.
But they are lighter now, we left everything heavy on some roof back at the river.
Minsk shouldered one and hefted up the other with barely a grunt.
Do not fret, young Frithia, this will be no burden to us.
Shouting from the street behind them, Solafane ducked as a bolt whistled over the roof to clatter uselessly against unseen cobbles.
They've caught us, Frithia, we must move. Head for the walls,
added Jahara,
and try to find some way over. From your vantage you should have a better chance than most. We will meet you on the road, at the tree where we stopped for high sun. Mon.
Pressed Frithia urgently. Jahara shrank back into the alley, one hand already shooing the girl onward with her hiss.
Do not worry, they will escape the town. We can track them afterwards. Now, go.
Shouts echoed along the street, 3 mercenaries skidding to a halt as they saw them in the alley.
They've got friends on the ground. Take them out.
2 crossbows raised, Jahara had not even the time to run. A scream split the air above and the men crumpled under a cascade of bricks. Jahara glanced up to find Fritha stood panting over the remains of the chimney stack. Minsk looked deeply impressed.
Young Fritha! Go on, run!
The girl cried, Cellophane trying to pull her away as another bolt whistled over the rooftop.
Before more come!
Jahara did not need to be convinced, the pair tearing across the next street to disappear south into the lane opposite, their escape secured. A hand fastened about Fritha's wrist, Cellophane urging her onward to their own. In the street, the mercs were shouting, cries to help their fallen lost to orders as their quarry broke cover again, the men giving chase along the street below. Cellophane had held the lead since they had fled, the girl amazed by the way he seemed to think a few roofs ahead, barely a pause to consider that jagged maze as he found them a route across the town. Ensuring each roof had a place where they could cross had made for a less direct path though, the pair wove southeast from the riverside to the houses of the merchants' quarter and that had slowed their pace considerably. The roofs there were much steeper than those of the warehouses, brittle tiles of clay replacing the cheaper wood, and the undulating surface offered little grip. Another bolt sailed over the roof before them, more men waiting in the street ahead. Cellophane darted left, sliding down the roof to leap for the building alongside. The abrupt jump saw him land hard. His knee jolted under him with the high-pitched shatter of breaking ceramics as his foot disappeared into the roof. Someone was shouting in the room below, Cellophane crouched and heaving at his foot. Fritha scattered yet more tiles with her own desperate leap to his side.
Sola! It's struck!
Below, the mercenaries had noticed their targets were now fixed. A bolt whistled past them to smash into the tiles, Fritha still fighting free his foot.
One of the straps is caught, I'll need to cut it. Fritha!
There was panic to his tone, a glance to the street behind confirmed the source. Two mercs, one with his crossbow leveled, slowly lining up the perfect shot. Cellophane was twisting violently, fighting to get past his tangled cloak to the daggers on the back of his belt.
Fritha, go! No, I won't!
He cursed in a tongue she did not know, a shard of tile snatched from the debris around them and hurled to the street. The merc pulled the trigger in his surprise, shot careening wildly off to the right as the tile caught him squarely in the face.
There!
Fritha gasped, knife sheathed, the boot at last cut free. Cellophane straightened with her, ready to flee once more.
Come, it cannot be far.
The explosion shook the night. Fritha lost her footing, Cellophane teetering back in his haste to catch her and, for a moment, they clung to each, fighting to regain their balance. Down by the river, fires had igniting the sky, the blaze bringing an early dawn above the town.
What has happened?
Murmured Cellophane, the man mesmerized by the flames that licked and danced about the warehouses, colliginous smoke boiling overhead. Fritha felt an inexplicable dread rise within her.
I don't know. Come on.
Valigar could see the river glimmering softly before them, the three hurtling from the darkness of the alley onto the open quays once more. Imoen whipped east to the pale grey walls that were still a good 200 yards away.
Bane's arse! I was sure we had come out right next to them. Come!
The order died on her lips. From streets and alleyways both behind and before them, they trooped, 2 squads of the town guards, the group at their backs headed by an extremely satisfied Captain Daviel.
You there, halt! We have you surrounded!
Imoen looked fit to explode in her anger.
You idiots! You know why we're running? To save you, so you don't force us to wipe your miserable lives from this wretched town.
Daviel snorted.
You believe you can defeat us all, witch?
A few of the men about him hefted their crossbows expressively.
Imoen,
warned Anomen. The captain could sense their uncertainty.
I will take you in. If you surrender, the crown demands your arrest and my honor will be satisfied with no less.
Imoen raised her chin, dark hair tossed back.
It's come to this, has it? Decide now, then, your honor or your town. Imoen,
barked Valigar, but it was too late. Daviel raised his hand for the order.
Men.
The girl's scream rose, soon lost to something far more primal, her arms thrown to the heaven, and above them the night was rent in two, fire clawing from the torn sky like the hand of some furious god. Within the rend, Valigar caught a glimpse of the blazing land beyond, and it was not without its denizens, creatures of pure flame pouring through the tear. The clatter of the dozen crossbows, bolts release into the sky in the panic, though the shots were ignored. The air was shrill with screaming as the creatures darted and swooped wildly over the keys, setting ablaze all they touched, desperate to make another home before their lives faded. All about them, warehouses were aflame, fires on nearby boats illuminating the dark river. Valigar noticed the stamped barrels on the deck of a low barge just in time.
Run!
They were barely a few paces away when the explosion rocked the keys. He did not look back, the rattle of Anomen's armor placing the man just behind, while Imoen was already in the lead once more, limbs flailing as she skidded into an alley and was gone. A glance behind before he followed her. Most of the guards were scrambling for anything that could hold water, fighting to stop the fires from spreading, only the sergeant and 3 guards ordered to pursue them for the captain's vanity. Back into that maze of alleyways, Imoen was doing her best to lead them eastwards, a sharp turn into a narrow passage finding them before a high wooden fence, a view of the grey town walls glimmering teasingly on the other side.
Another dead end!
She gasped. Anomen hardly cared in his anger.
What in Helm's name was that? You opened a portal to some hell. It wasn't a hell. And released a horde of beasts upon this city, setting ablaze half the keys in the process. It was a few poxy warehouses. Imoen,
the gravity to his tone stopped their argument dead, dark eyes boring down at her, cutting through the shadows to meet her own.
Why? I was just bluffing at first,
the girl reasoned, almost pleadingly.
I never thought he'd risk attacking us. Then when he did, well, what was I supposed to do? Stand there while he filled us with crossbow bolts? Or maybe you would like to be sat in a cell right now and force the others to come rescue us? Imoen, that spell!
She cut him off impatiently.
Look, we don't have time for your superstitions right now, Vals. Come on, we can climb this.
The girl fetched out the rope, her pack lobbed easily over the high fence, Valigar left to throw his Anomen's over while the knight gave Imoen a boost to the top.
Come on, then,
she urged, tying the rope to some unseen anchor on the other side before disappearing into the gloom beyond. Anomen turned to him.
Here, I will help you. I can still climb a rope,
Valigar assured the man sharply,
and likely better than you in that armor. Here.
He gave the knight a leg up, iron cuirass scraping against the molding wood as Anomen hauled his bulk over the top. Valigar took up the rope just as shouts rang from the alley mouth.
There's one!
Imoen's cry echoed against the tall buildings.
Vals!
In a split decision between flee and fight he chose the latter, rope dropped to fall back against rotting slats, his clawed hand bracing the scabbard as he drew the long katana. In the confines of the alley, he had not the space to maneuver. The 2 men were armed with blades and shields, a wall of painted metal advancing quickly down the passage, trying to confine him further for an easy kill. The younger of them broke first, dropping to lunge from behind his cover. Valigar kicked the shield aside, the curving metal blocking his ally's attack, and a quick thrust to the chest saw the guard choking on his own blood. The man collapsed with a gurgled cry, Valigar dancing back from the body as his friend pressed in, rage behind every blow, and shield braced out to guard against the mistake that killed his ally. The ranger was running out of room, sharp thrusts needling him back, his own attacks caught every time by that large shield. If only he could have put some power behind them. The weaker, one-handed blows were deflected effortlessly. Panic as his back suddenly met the wall behind. The guard seized his chance, leaping forward to smash his shield into Valigar's sword arm, the ranger's body open for the blade that was lunging towards him. His free hand drew back, and Valigar braced for the pain as instinct drove it forward in a last, thoughtless attempt to halt his end. A man's scream, it took Valigar a moment to realize it was not his own, the two men suddenly frozen, neither able to pull away from the black tendrils that had whipped from his twisted hand. Valigar saw his horror mirrored in that withering face, the guard mouthing in agony as the life was drained from him. A jolt threw them both and, at last, he could move again, Valigar jerking back to drop the guard dead at his feet. For an instant, it was all he could do to stand, the revulsion trembling through him. A scuffle on the fence above and over the top a familiar pale face emerged.
Vals, oh, thanks be. You're all right.
Yes, he managed eventually, he did not mean it. Imoen smiled, gesturing to the rope.
I knew they wouldn't be a match for you. A noman's got the other end. Brace on the wall and we'll pull you over.
The eastern gatehouse was slowly emerging from behind the final house. Their pace had slowed somewhat from the frantic dash of their initial escape, Minsk jogging along behind her and panting roughly, though he showed no signs of dwindling as they, at last, left the street to cross the small open plaza before the gates. The way was clear now, only one step left before freedom was theirs, and whatever that explosion had been, it had secured it. The gates were shut and barred, the solid wooden surface set with a smaller wicket door where two guards were standing on watch, lamps held aloft for a better view of the two who were running towards them.
You! Guard!
Snapped Jahara, coming to a halt before the nearest.
Captain Daviel sent us, you are to report to the riverside immediately to bolster firefighting efforts there. We are to watch the gate in your absence.
The pair shared a look. Jahara gave no time for any doubts to find a voice.
No stalling, man, the town burns. Which do you think holds importance here, this gate or your homes?
That saw them moving, a brief order not to open the gate to anyone, and the pair were herring off, armor rattling like an arms box. Jahara waited until their footsteps had faded, a smile shared with Minsk as he lifted the narrow bar that held the wicket, pushing it open to stand back with mock chivalry, and they both stepped out into the silent plains. The three skidded to a halt, Imoen whipping back and forth along the empty riverside. The town walls loomed to their left, the river before them, snaking its way through the archway to disappear into the plains, the choppy waters a molten course of black and gold in the light of distant fires. The walls had been built a few feet into the river on each bank to prevent any from crossing the opening on foot, a thick chain drawn across the gap to provide a similar measure for any boats.
Now what?
Huffed a Nomen. Imoen grinned, letting her pack drop from her shoulder.
Now we walk out.
She raised her arms, though more from habit than any need to direct the magic, the energy seeping from her, a gradual thing after her previous explosions of power. At first, nothing seemed to be happening, the men shifting impatiently at her side, and then it came, beginning at the stone quay just before her to span across the water in delicate tendrils that froze everything they touched. The opaque fingers webbed out, crossing and recrossing in the spiraled dance of dragonflies, until the whole surface of the river, from where she stood to a few feet past the walls, was ice, river water still lapping at the edges.
Imoen!
Breathed the knight, Valigar too astonished to manage even her name as they goggled at the glistening black surface.
Yeah, I know, I'm amazing. Come on!
She laughed, hefting up her pack and taking that first cherry step.
See, whoa! Mind out, it's slippery. And where are we to head after this?
Asked Anomen, still on the keys and eyeing her handiwork with a distrustful frown. Valigar shrugged, cautiously easing his weight onto that frozen shell.
Back to the road. If I know Jahara, that is where she will have gone.
That instant of faith took her across another jump, Solifane pausing only to ensure she was behind him before he was off once more and across the jumble of rooftops she could see it rising, a tonic to her flagging body, the walls. Solifane veered left, cresting the peak of the roof they were on and sliding down the other side to leap a narrow alley onto the large building next to it, its mismatched muddle of roofs reminding Fritha of the star spires. A long terrace of 8 or so homes, more added over the years until it had extended right up to the walls. Fritha crossed the apex, Solifane pausing to wait for her on the lee. Inside, the roofs all met to leave a sheltered valley that ran the length of the block, a hidden world of sooty windows and chimney stacks where many birds had found a roost for the night. At the end, the roofs opened, the grey walls just visible behind the tall wooden scaffold that had been erected there, presumably to enable repairs to the rusted weather vane that was drooping from the rightmost roof and set to take half the gable with it. And it was there upon the scaffold she saw them, the sharp silhouettes of men stood against the burnt sky. For a moment no one moved. The fires at the river had lit the sky to both advantage and detriment. 3 men with blades were standing upon the roofs about 2 houses along from them, while on the scaffold at the very end another 3 were waiting. 2 held crossbows poised, a swarthy man towering between them with a distinct air of triumph. It was the mercenary captain, Geraint. They had been headed off. Fritha glanced to the man next to her. That silent spark of understanding, and she darted right, diving for the cover of a chimney stack as a bolt whipped past, the birds there taking flight in a chaos of beating wings. Behind her, Solifane had raced up the roof to their left, sword drawn and cloak thrown back, and he left the apex in a leap that saw one of the approaching mercenaries cut down where he stood, the 2 left pressing the attack.
Get the girl!
Yelled Geraint. Another arrow just missed her shoulder to splinter against the tiles of a protruding window, Fritha already up again bolting for the next stack. On the roofs behind, Solifane was an easy match for his clumsy adversaries, the drow balanced upon the curved tiles of the apex with the advantage of both height and agility. The second man faltered, overbalancing with a swing to his feet. The drow did not give him chance for another, blade stabbed brutally into the back of his neck. Fritha was crouched in the lee of the last chimney stack. There was still a length of 2 houses to cover before she reached the end, the men there ready with crossbows trained. For an instant, time seemed almost to stop, marked only by the steady pulse of her heart. 1, 2, 3. Fritha sprang from behind the chimney, one shot just grazing her thigh, the other dodged as she dropped to a roll. The way was clear now, the scaffold just yards before her. She willed herself faster, the girl bringing her blade up to ready the blow.
Reload!
Geraint roared, his anger doing nothing to help that panicked scrabbling.
Now!
Fritha hurtled into the scaffold with such force she was surprised it still stood. Above, Geraint was bellowing his orders, neither bowman able to get a clear shot. Now the frame itself was her cover. Thick ropes had been knotted about the 2 corner poles, tying the scaffold to the roof. One good swing saw the first rope falling limply into the street below. The frame lurched sideways. Geraint drew his sword and dropped to his knees, suddenly wild as he scrambled to protect the last binding.
No!
Frithha raised her blade. Geraint lunged for her an instant too late, sword lost as the scaffold toppled sideways, a last good kick from her sending it smashing into the street next to them. On the roofs behind her, the final mercenary was bleeding at the knee, a desperate swing to the drow's head sealing his fate. Solafane slid down the tiles, dodging the swipe to place himself under the man's guard. A sword thrust up caught him under his cuirass with force enough to overbalance him, his body toppling backwards over the apex to plummet into the street beyond. They seemed to turn at once to find each another, the pair alone once more in that hidden valley. A strange sense of calm filled Frithha as the drow rejoined her, and together they made the last few paces to the edge of the roofs. Across a narrow chasm of shadow, the grey stone walls shone white, the deep crenulations providing a handy step for some wading foot. It was too wide a gap to jump, a spare plank from the scaffold thrown across to provide an unsteady bridge. Solafane went first, the man walking across to drop into the darkness beyond. Frithha followed him, pausing a moment at the wall, the whole town laid out before her. The fires along the river had sent a haze of embers up to replace the fading stars. People were leaving their houses in the commotion, men and women stood in the street, coats thrown over bedclothes as they shared worried exchanges with their neighbors. From what Frithha could see from her vantage, the guards had the blaze mostly contained by now, helped by the proximity of a large source of water. Solafane had stepped back to wait for her, the girl dropping down to join him in the shadow of the wall. Together they skirted the edge almost to the eastern gates before striking out, leaving its shelter to head southeast across the plains, back towards the road they had agreed to meet upon. The air was fresh and bracing, Solafane feeling strangely free without the ever-present burden of his pack. Frithha glanced back to the town, a smoking dot of grey on the plains.
I hope the others got out all right. They will have,
he assured her firmly. The girl sent him a smile that became a giggle, the emotion blossoming until the pair were sending laughter high into the milky sky in a moment that felt more relief than joy, their mirth fading without words to leave them breathless and wistful.
Ah, we do get into some trouble,
Frithha sighed, an absent hand held out to pluck a sky-blue cornflower from the long grass.
And look, the sun is rising.
Solafane shaded his eyes to take in the burning sliver that it was glorying distant meadows in a effulgent white. Frithha handed him the flower with a smile.
Summer's blessings upon you, Sola.
And the memory of it burned there long after the breeze had stolen the moist heat where she had kissed him gently on the cheek. End of chapter.